There are two quite different ways of answering this question. At first, Storm on the Island appears to be a poem about just that. There is a group of people who know that a storm is coming. They've prepared for the storm to come, but in reality, the storm was much stronger than they thought it was going to be, and they weren't actually ready for the storm. That's one level to it. Another side is that the entire poem is an extended metaphor for the political troubles of Northern Ireland, and I'll talk more about that later when I go through the context for this poem. The reason we could say that is partly because Seamus Heaney is an Irish poet, but also because of the name of the poem Storm on the Island. Storm on, and then the letter T from the, spells out Stormont, which is the name of the Irish Parliament. There are four main themes to Storm on the Island: the power of humans, the power of nature, the relationship between nature and humans, and the hubris of humans. Hubris means excessive pride or self-confidence. So all of these are very heavily interlinked, because essentially this poem explores how human beings believe they have power over nature initially, but in reality, they don't. Nature is the one with the ultimate power. And so the relationship is all about that sense of us thinking we can control nature, but nature really is kind of unpredictable and can't really be controlled. That also links to the hubris of humankind because of our arrogance in thinking that we can control nature. So humans, nature, they're the main themes going on. But of course, it can also be then linked back to, if we think about our Northern Irish metaphor, it can all be linked back to that theme of politics in Ireland, and how all of this humankind's power of humankind versus power of nature is itself a metaphor for the theme of the politics of Ireland. There's no hard and fast rule of like the perfect quote that will always work for every situation. You need to be able to adapt, to know all the different kinds of quotes in the poem well enough so that you can tailor it for the specific question and the specific argument that you're trying to prove. That being said, I am going to show you what I think are some of the richest techniques to be able to analyze in this poem. And to clarify, what I mean by richest is they've got plenty of things for you to be able to talk about in a decent amount of detail. First of all, the poem starts with a really confident, calm, and friendly tone. And we get that from, for example, the very opening line, "We are prepared, we build our houses squat." The use of the declaratives create a real sense of like certainty that we are prepared, very, very confident from the very beginning. You also get it from the slightly colloquial language in phrases like, "you know what I mean." Those kinds of phrases help make it feel almost conversational with the person that the speaker of the poem is speaking to. The second technique that I think is always worth analysing in this poem is the semantic field of war. And we get that from words like blast, exploding, strafes, salvo, bombarded. Not only is there this semantic field of war, and we can analyse how that presents the battle between humans and nature as being like a war, we can also analyse it from a perspective of the changing relationship and how actually in the first few lines there's no language to do with war at all. Then it starts to be quite a big gap in between them. So there's quite a big gap in between blast and exploding. And then suddenly it becomes very intense with lots of it towards the end. So we can use that as a kind of metaphorical representation of the relationship, the fast changing relationship between humans and nature, and how quickly actually that human beings can lose our power and it can become a conflict when once we thought we had all the control. Linked to that idea is the simile, "spits like a tame cat turned savage." So there you're able to analyse, first of all, the tame cat and its connotations of being controlled, being domesticated, not being a threat, and then also how that changes and the connotations of savage, and how that is basically all linked to that idea of, again, the relationship between humans and nature and how quickly that relationship can change, but also how human beings thought that they had control of nature. Nature was our tame cat, and how actually it turns out we didn't have control of it at all. Finally, there's the fact that there is, in this entire poem, an extended metaphor with everything about this storm on this island all being a giant metaphor for the political troubles of Ireland. So it seems like it's about a storm versus human beings. Actually, it's about the Irish against themselves. Some people have also said it's about, an Irish versus British, with the British attempts to kind of take control, have power in Ireland as well. So you can basically view it as, okay, in that case, who's the we? Who's the ones representing humankind, and who's the storm where you think you've got it controlled and actually you haven't? And the most common interpretation here is that the ones that think they're in control and have all the arrogance is like the British, and then actually it's kind of like the Irish that are the storm itself. In terms of when it's thinking about the Irish conflict of Catholics versus Protestants, then it becomes much more like, which side is he talking about? Seamus Heaney was himself Northern Irish, but that doesn't automatically mean that he was saying Northern Ireland thought it controlled the rest, or that kind of thing. It's much more ambiguous there which side of Ireland sits or which side. But regardless, you're still able to analyse it from a perspective of it's looking at that conflict between the two different sides of Ireland. I'm going to try to tie in the structural devices I highlight with the language ones I talked about, because one of the best things you can do in an essay is analyse both language and structure and how they kind of complement one another and build on one another. So first of all, we talked in language about how this poem has a confident, calm and friendly tone. And that is reinforced by the privileged position of the very first line. The fact that that tone comes out in the very first line is significant in showing how humankind felt that they had it from the very beginning. Spotting that change in that confident tone is also important in structure, this time with a technique called volta. A volta is when there is a strong change in the feelings or emotions in the poem. In this case, going from the speaker of the poem feeling really confident and feeling in control to feeling like they are being attacked and nature is the one in control. And we see that with the line, "but no." Now, the poem has just been talking about how nature doesn't trouble them. It almost like leaves them alone. It's isolated from them. There's no trees. There's no natural shelter. The sea is over there. It's distant from you. It almost feels comfortable. It's like a nice distance in its danger. There's certainly suggestions that nature can pose a threat, but human beings still feel in control. That changes when we hit the "but no" and we get that simile of spits like a tame cat turned savage. So you could, when you're looking at that change from feeling in control and powerful to lacking it, you could combine the structural analysis of looking at the volta with the analysis of the simile spits like a tame cat turned savage. We could also analyse the fact that this poem is stichic. That means it is not broken down into stanzas. It is one block all together. Now, this could perhaps be used as a metaphor for the relationship between humans and nature, because we, with our kind of intertwined with nature, we can't separate the two. And so it's perhaps exploring the relationship between the two and the fact that we can't actually really get away from one another. We're very much in it together. Finally, there's the semantic field of war that I mentioned before. Now, I basically already analysed this from a structural perspective, but I just want to highlight that again. The fact that the semantic field is quite spaced out in the beginning and then becomes very intense towards the end. That's a structural point to analyse, because again, it's a symbol of how the sense of power and control and the conflict between humans and nature is changing as the poem goes on. For the context of this poem, there's basically three big things you want to know. First of all, from the perspective of this being a poem about a storm on an island, Well, that would make sense from Seamus Heaney's personal life. He grew up in a farming community that lived near the coast. So it would make sense that he's writing about the experiences that they had with actual storms on an actual island. Also, this poem was published in 1966 and the Irish Troubles began in the 1960s. I'm not going to go into a deep history of the Irish Troubles here because that is way beyond the scope of this video, but it'll be really easy for you to do the research on if you just type into Google Irish Troubles summary, something like that. You know how to Google, you don't need me to tell you.